My guest today is Mr. Ray Fox, who is from the Bottom Line Consultancy. Good morning, Ray.
Morning, how are you?
I'm not too bad. Thank you for taking the time this morning. So, just a short little interview really, just want to know more about what it is that you do. So, I understand you've got an unusual academic and commercial background. Tell me a little more.
Okay, I have a very strange background. I went to university, I have a degree in psychology. I qualified with a degree in industrial psychology and human behaviour, and I went to work in a variety of companies over the course of my working life. Originally, I worked for a large electronics company, so I was building, believe it or not, submarines, aircraft systems. I worked for a company that made airfield landing lights and domestic hot water cylinders. And along the way, I trained part-time to become a charter secretary. So I'm an FCIS charter secretary, trained to become a company secretary. And believe it or not, added into that, I'm also a qualified hypnotist and hypnotherapist. So I have a very, very weird background.
Okay. Okay. And so what sort of work were you doing before you set up the Bottom Line Consultancy? Any hypnotism in there?
Well, the weird thing about being a company secretary is that it doesn't really matter what type of business you work in, because basically you're doing the same sort of work. So whether you work for a company that's making rubber ducks or whether it's nuclear engineering, it's basically the same sort of work. So when I first qualified, the first job I had, believe it or not, was working for a company that were doing door-to-door selling, pots and pans and brushes and that sort of thing. That was sort of door-to-door. I then moved on to become the company secretary of a lift engineering company, heavy engineering, and after that I was headhunted and became the company secretary for Dun & Bradstreet. And for those of you who don't know, Dun & Bradstreet are the world's biggest information and data company. So I became their UK company secretary, their European company secretary, secretary for all of their UK businesses, and also their legal and pensions director. So that was a very, very weird a background of different working environments.
Right. Okay. So during your time at Dun & Bradstreet as a company secretary, did you have much contact with solicitors then in that employment?
Well, most company secretaries deal with lots of external professional advisors, and Dun & Bradstreet was no different. The primary difference between Dun & Bradstreet and other companies was that Dun & Bradstreet was a very litigious company, and for the entire time I was there, Dun & Bradstreet was always either being sued by somebody or suing somebody else. And in my last full year there, my legal budget was around about £250,000. We were a very, very heavy spender of legal bucks. It was a very big part of what we were doing, and I spent most of my time defending libel actions and negligence actions, which Dun & Bradstreet seemed to be very culpable. So yes, I used to use loads of law firms and primarily city firms when Dun & Bradstreet were based in the city, and then when we relocated out to High Wycombe, which is near where I live, I then started using some of the local firms in High Wycombe, and so I was using at one time sort of 5 or 6 different law firms.
Right. Okay, so that's how I suppose you first started working with them, when you were defending these libel actions.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically what happened when I left Dun & Bradstreet, particularly the local firms were incredibly excited about having the prospect of the former legal director of Dun & Bradstreet acting with them as a consultant, and that's basically how I got involved with solicitors right from day one. So it became a very a weird scenario to be working with solicitors at that time, but they all seemed to clamber around me to get me to come and work for them, which is really how I got involved to begin with. Okay.
And so what was you first doing when you were working with them?
Well, the thing with solicitors is that they, for the most part, they're not very good at running their businesses. And right at the very beginning, I got involved in marketing, and basically what I was doing was had a very simple idea of generating commercial clients. So I started working with law firms initially generating clients for them. And I developed a product which I called sort of database segmentation. So if you start, say, in my local town, High Wycombe, draw a circle around High Wycombe, say 10, 15 miles, my role then was to identify the data on the companies within a certain geographical area that had a particular turnover or a particular type of work. And because of my knowledge of the Dun & Bradstreet databases, I could pull off raw data on organizations that match those geographical and industry parameters, and then use that data to help the law firm target those companies for legal services. And that's basically how I started.
I see. And so I suppose initially you found that the solicitors weren't very good with their marketing then?
That's probably the understatement of a lifetime, yes. Most solicitors didn't have a clue who their clients were. They didn't know why a client chose that law firm to give them legal services. They didn't know how to generate new clients. They knew very little about marketing, had no idea about databases, and it was just incredibly hit and miss. Most of the law firms I worked with at the beginning basically opened the post every day, and if work came in, great, and if the work didn't come in, they actually had no idea how to generate it. They really didn't know what they were good at and what they were bad at, and that was 18, 19 years ago, but I don't really think it's changed that much.
Right, okay. And then, so how did you move on from just offering the marketing support to offering other support services to
Well, what I found, I mean, solicitors as a generic body seem to run very isolated businesses. They're, you know, from a psychologist's perspective, they are very introspective. They're entrepreneurial. They're not creative. Some of the firms I work with don't talk to each other, you know, in terms of partners don't talk to one another, branches don't talk to one another. So they seem very isolated, and when they have a problem, and it hasn't changed that much today, but when a law firm hits a brick wall and hits an impasse, they actually don't have a natural route to go to get help. So I found that these law firms that I was originally helping them with marketing turned to me and said, oh, we're having problems with recruitment, we're having problems raising finance, we're having problems getting PI insurance or general insurance or medical insurance. They wanted help with brochures and newsletters and mail shots and databases. And so my business moved from being purely marketing to being one of you know, the universal panacea for all solicitors' ills. And in fact, at one time I used to market myself as like the aspirin for solicitors' headaches. And that was really how the business moved on. Solicitors, for the most part, don't have a support mechanism. They can't talk to their accountants because accountants don't understand how law firms work. They can't talk to the bank because the bank will pull the overdraft. They can't talk to the law society because they're like a trade union that ties your hands behind your back. Can't talk to a competitor because the competitor's normally got the same problem, or they have a good laugh. So they all started talking to me, which was very weird.
Okay. And then how did you come up with the idea of acting as a broker for the law firms? I suppose because they were all talking to you then.
Well, if I'm really honest, before I got involved in acting as a broker, it had never occurred to me. It never entered my conscience that a law firm would want to sell its practice. It just, in all the work I'd done, it never crossed my mind. And I had a client who basically said, you know, along the lines of, we've got offices in towns A, B, C, and D, and we want to find a firm to buy in town X. And this town had about 12 law firms in it, and I knew most of the senior partners in that town. I started ringing them up, and along the lines of, you know, I've got a client who's looking to buy a practice in your town. Do you know anybody who wants to sell? And the reaction I got from the first guy I telephoned was, oh my God, thank God you've rung. Yes, I will be delighted to sell. And that threw me completely. The odd thing was that the second guy I rang, and the third guy I rang, and the fourth guy I rang, they all said the same. They all wanted to sell. And I had this image of almost like a tsunami in his town, that they all wanted to sell their practices, and it just never occurred to me. And so, you know, you get the light bulb comes on in your brain, thinking, good Lord, there's people out there who want to sell their law firms. I wonder if there's other people actually going to instruct me to do it, and that's where I got the idea.
Okay, so then, okay, that's interesting. So having found that gap in the market and having that light bulb idea, what happened after you sold like the first couple of firms, and you know how much did you know how much to sell them for?
Well, the odd thing, because of what I've done in the past, is that I'm really good with the database stuff. So when I first started going to law firms, I said to them, look, I've never done this before, and I was quite open and honest. But the logic is very simple. If you've got a database with all the buyers on it, and you've got a database with all the sellers on it, the logic is just bring the two parties together. But obviously the big gap there was not knowing what to sell the firms for. So what I started doing with the first firms was saying, you know, I will get your firm in the market very ethically, very professionally, confidentially, and let you and the buyer sort out the price of what the firm is going to be worth. As long as you tell me at the end, you know, what you sold the firm for, that's the way we should play it. So that's basically what I did. So I started marketing the firms, and I was amazed, and I am still amazed how many people come out into the marketplace and say they want to buy a practice. But the important thing from my perspective was that because they were all ringing me, I could then interview the buyers and say, well, you know, the first firm that I actually sold was in the Reading area, and I had people ringing me saying they wanted to buy, and I would say, well, why do you want to buy this practice? And some of them it was because it might have a franchise, or it might be in the right geographical area, or they might be expanding, or they're a firm in Newbury and they want to be in Reading, or it was a firm in London and they want to be near Reading, or it was a firm looking to expand in a particular type of marketplace. So I was getting really powerful feedback as to why the buyers were buying the practices, and then I was getting the feedback then on what the firms were being sold for. And what I started to realize was that different types of legal work are valued in a different way. So a firm that's doing conveyancing is valued differently to a firm that's doing commercial employment, different to a firm doing legal aid, criminal, or immigration, or company commercial. And that was how it all started.
Okay. I heard that one of the major city firms were the first to instruct you to carry out a practice valuation. What were the circumstances surrounding that valuation?
Well, I won't say the name of the firm, but basically I had a phone call from a very, very large city firm, and they were involved. They had a client who was getting a divorce. It was a lady client. She was married to the principal of a large law firm, and the background then was that she wanted half the value of the law firm as part of the divorce settlement, and I thought that was pretty creative because I would never have thought of that. The husband was saying nobody's ever sold a law firm, they don't have any value, and the wife was saying, well, you make an awful lot of money from this law firm, it must have a value. So I was basically asked to go into this law firm and approach it as a conceptual exercise, in the sense of if this firm was put on the market, who would buy it, why would they buy it, and what would the structure of the deal be, and how would it be paid, and what would they pay for it. So that's basically what I did. So I went along to this law firm, asked for lots of financial information, put together a report for this law firm. They thought it was fantastic, which was very gratifying. They submitted it in evidence as part of the divorce case. A couple of barristers got hold of the report, and the next thing the phone started ringing. And it's been ringing now for 18 years. And that's how it all started.
Okay, that's interesting. And what other reasons have people given for their firms requiring an evaluation? So, you know, you've got a lady there who's getting divorced.
Oh, I've had everything you could imagine, from partners joining, partners leaving, partners dying. I've done them for probate. I've done quite a few for divorce. I've done them for firms that are selling, firms that are buying. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of valuations for firms that are incorporating, so they're trying to get a balance sheet value for goodwill, which they can put into their limited company, which is actually a very interesting area than working, because there is no published information on what law firms are worth. In fact, I think the only person in the country that actually knows what law firms are worth is me.
Yeah.
So when firms are submitting their documentation to HMRC for a balance sheet and goodwill valuations, the revenue generally dispute the valuation, but they actually don't have any information on what law firms really sell for. So when I go back to them saying I've worked for all these firms and this is what it's worth in the marketplace, the revenue are having great difficulty contesting my valuations because there's actually no evidence to support a differing opinion. So that's becoming a very big part of what I do. But I mean, I've done them for, I did one recently for a woman that had been committed into a mental institution. I've had another one for a lady that broke her neck in a car crash, and
Oh,
she owned a law firm. She'd been rear-ended by a truck and couldn't work again, so they were suing the insurers for the driver, and I had to value the lady's law firm. I think my favourite one of all time was being called by a firm who rang and told me that they had just fired one of their equity partners and wanted to value how much the firm was worth. They could pay her off, and I remember saying, well, it's really unusual to fire an equity partner, and they said, well, yes, she's just got 10 years for attempting to murder her husband. So I have a lot of fun. Different firms, all requiring different scenarios, and every firm's different.
Right. Any particular, what? So I mean, what sort of firms? So the major city firms.
I've worked. I mean, obviously, I won't mention names, but I've worked for Magic Circle firms, some of the really big firms. I've worked for firms that are top 50, top 100 firms that are looking to buy, right down to, I mean, quite literally Mickey Mouse firms, one-man bands, sole practitioners turning over 40, 50,000 who want to retire. I had one lady that was turning over 20,000 asking to help her sell her business. So I've worked for everything from a one-man band right up to multinationals.
Okay. How many would you say, roughly, over the past 18 years?
The latest count, I've worked for around about 650 law firms in total, and of those, I reckon I have valued about 350, and I've sold about 150. So it's a very extensive network. Worked for every different type of firm, covering the whole of the UK, from Land's End to John O'Groats, including Scotland. I've worked for firms in Northern Ireland. I've worked for firms in Southern Ireland, North Wales. I've got a client I'm selling at the moment in Anglesey, right down to the Isle of Wight. The whole UK, everybody and anybody.
Okay. And what's the market like now?
It's a very weird market, actually. I am amazed at how well the market's picked up. I am swamped with inquiries from people that want to sell, which probably doesn't surprise you or anybody. What does surprise me is the number of people who want to buy, and I'm selling on average 2, sometimes 3 firms a month. Last year I sold 28 firms, so it's a very busy market. There are lots of multi-site practices. Firms that have 8 offices want 9, firms that have 5 offices want 6. Firms that are in one town want to move into another town. I think the biggest area that I'm seeing at the moment are the startups. Lots of Bill and Ben guys, girls, newly qualified, people looking to buy their first practice, people who've been made redundant, or they're walking out with a department and they're buying a law firm as a platform. And one of the major difficulties that the startup market have is they can't get insurance. The PI market is very difficult, and the tail is now wagging the dog. By that I mean the insurance industry is now dictating who can be solicitors, whereas it used to be the other way around. And so the only way a lot of solicitors can actually get PI cover is to actually buy a small practice as a going concern, appoint themselves as partners, the incumbents resign, and then the new guys have got a law firm with a name and a track record and a database, but more importantly, the PI insurance. So the market is incredibly buoyant.
Okay, that's interesting. So the biggest town to where you live is High Wycombe and Oxford. So suppose you've got a 3-partner high street practice with a turnover of, say, £1 million, and they're looking to sell. What sort of buyers would be interested in a practice like that?
Well, as I said earlier, it's a weird market. There's very little logic as to who is buying and why, but for the most part, a small practice in that area, off the top of my head, you would find, say, a firm in Birmingham or a firm in Banbury who are maybe looking to move nearer London. In fact, I sold a firm in Reading some years back to a firm in Cardiff. They were looking to target London, and Reading was a stop-off point. So you get lots of firms like that who are looking for a geographical move. It could be a large city firm lots of city firms buy practices in the provinces, maybe to move some of their overheads into a lower cost environment. So you might get a city firm want to move their personnel or their marketing people out into a low cost environment, and then use that branch as a platform to target local commercial firms. I say it could be a couple of guys, Bill and Ben, starting up from scratch. It could be a firm on the south coast. I mean, firms in Southampton have bought practices in Reading. Firms in Birmingham have moved into Reading. There are 2 or 3 city firms that have offices in Oxford. There's firms from Manchester and Nottingham have moved into Milton Keynes. So there's a lot of activity. Firms are buying up practices to move into different locations, or they're buying a firm like that because it might have a franchise. So another firm might be buying a practice because they're short of work. So they might have a large database of a will bank, and they want to increase their will bank exposure. So different buyers are looking to expand into different geographical locations, but for a whole host of reasons. There's very little logic in it. Sometimes I look back at the firms I've sold and I cannot imagine how that happened. And I remember selling a firm in Bournemouth to a guy that was living in Cheshire. And when I asked him, he told me that he had a holiday home in Bournemouth and he was looking to retire, wanted to buy a practice in Bournemouth, which he could then live in, work in, and then retire. A couple of years back, I sold a firm in Oxford, believe it or not, to a guy that was living in Tenerife. You know, there's very little logic, but it's a very buoyant market.
Okay. And so say that you got this high street practice, 3 partners with the turnover of $1 million. How much would someone pay for a firm like that? And how does it work? Do you pay it straight? Do they pay straight the amount straight up?
It's the most common question I'm asked by solicitors is I've got a practice, how much is it worth? And it's the one question that you can't answer without spending 2 or 3 hours. It's a bit like saying to an estate agent, you know, I've got a 5-bedroom house in the country, how much is it worth? But I don't want you to come and have a look at it, if you follow the logic. So there is no set multiple. You know, years and years ago, solicitors had a notion that a firm was worth, you know, or accountants would tell us it was worth 2.25 times net profit or 1.5 times gross income or whatever. But now the market isn't like that. The market now is built around the revenue streams within the practice. So there is not a fixed multiple. The multiple is now based on how much of your firm is conveyancing, how much of your firm is a will bank, how much of your firm is you know, matrimonial, legal aid, personal injury, and each element within that practice is then weighted separately based on the previous firms that I've sold. So even if you then pull together a very raw valuation, what you then have to factor in are things like, do they have a good website, do they have a good database, do they have passing trade, do they have negligence claims, do they have security tenure in their property, do they have dilapidations, do the partners own the property and they're charging a higher rent to milk the law firm for tax purposes. Maybe it's owned by an offshore company, maybe it's owned by their pension plan, maybe the lease has expired and they're holding over. So it's not now it's not just the turnover of the firm that's critical. There are 30, 40 other factors that I feed into a model that I built, which gives me an idea of what the firm is worth. So it's you know, years back there was a fixed relationship, but now it's variable, and you could see 20 firms doing the same turnover in the same town and have different valuations for each one of them. So there's no fixed arrangement anymore.
Okay. What's like top 3 things someone could do to make their firm be worth more?
Okay, again, it's a question I get asked a lot. The things that I always tell law firms when they're thinking of selling are firstly, to start early. Don't leave it till the last minute. Solicitors seem to think that it's going to happen overnight. And I have had examples where people have rung me the beginning of December and said they've got to be out by Christmas. I've had people ring me and tell me they've got to be out in 8 days.
Oh, gosh.
I find that there is a weird expectation as to how long it takes. So you've got to allow 8, 9 months, a year to really make this work properly. So the first thing I say is start early. The second thing I always say to firms is that if there's one thing that a buyer really doesn't like are lots of debts on the ledger. So I always tell my clients to tidy up their debtors ledger, to get rid of old debts. There's no point in doing work for clients who aren't paying you, and it looks far neater to write off debts, collect old debts. Another thing that's very powerful for a buyer is to have a decent electronic database, because the first thing that a buyer wants to do is to write to everybody and say, you know, Joe Blow is retired and I'm Billy Bloggins and I've taken over the practice, and the buyer wants to be able to write to everybody. So having a decent database with the client records on is one of the most important things that a buyer is looking for, and it increases the value of the firm when they're selling. And I think the last thing I would say, in all cases, and solicitors are very much at fault at this, is that they have to expect to spend money for professional advice. And solicitors who make their living giving advice don't seem to like to spend money to get advice. So they have to get proper professional advice in terms of getting the firm valued, getting the firm marketed, and using professional solicitors who understand the commercial side of actually selling not just a business but a law firm. There are very, very few solicitors that have that expertise. Obviously I've got contacts with solicitors who have that expertise, but I find that my clients don't want to spend the money. In fact, I've even had solicitors say to me, well, I can't afford that, this guy's going to charge you £250 an hour. And I just thought,
Yeah.
that's what you charge. Why can you charge that? You're not prepared to pay it. So, but taking professional advice is a really important thing, especially for solicitors.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting. And so what's like the process then? So you mentioned, you know, it takes, you know, could take up to a year. So say someone's out there, they're interested in selling their firm,
Yep.
they contact you, and then what happens after that?
Well, it's a slow process in one sense, because what I'm doing for the firm is generally highly confidential. So, you know, when I go into a practice, I can hardly walk in and say, hi everybody, I'm Ray Fox, I come to sell the practice. You know, in many cases the principals don't tell the staff what's going on.
Okay.
So, for the starting point, it's incredibly confidential. So to market a firm, you know, you can't say in an email shot, you know, sole practitioner in High Wycombe for sale, because that would identify the target. So the marketing is very discreet. So it might say a sole practitioner in Buckinghamshire, or a sole practitioner in the HP postcode area, or a sole practitioner along the M40. So part of the process is to keep it confidential, but also to work off curiosity. So my marketing approach is built incredibly heavily around curiosity. I want people to ring up and say to me, oh, I see you've got a firm for sale in Buckinghamshire, who is it?
Yeah.
And obviously I don't tell them, but I generate the leads and inquiries through that process. But the marketing is then done very heavily by email. We have at the moment about 90,000 email addresses. We've probably got one of the very few working databases in the country. So we have about 90,000 emails, virtually every law firm in the country that has an email address, virtually every solicitor that's working in private practice. We have 2 websites, which I will plug, solicitorsupermarket.biz and bottomlineconsultancy.com. So we market the firms through there. We market them through LinkedIn. We market them through CoreLegal, and we market them through the Law Society Gazette. So it's a very heavily processed marketing exercise. But the reason why it takes so long is actually not because of anything that I do or anything that the seller does. The reason why it takes so long is because the buyer is typically a solicitor. And solicitors, for the most part, spend their life dotting I's, crossing T's, keeping their head down below the parapet and being very risk averse. So it's very hard to get the buyers to go through the process. They actually want to buy a practice, but for them, in many cases, it's a very slow process because they have to go back to their partners to get consensus. There are too many partners meetings and delegations that visit, and it could take 6 to 8 months to put the deal together.
Okay. And so your role, you're matching the buyers and the sellers, and then you're helping the sellers come up with a valuation.
As I say to all my clients, I do marriage broking, not consummation. Okay, so by that I mean my primary primary role is to get the firm into the marketplace discreetly and professionally and ethically, and to generate a succession of buyers for that seller. Okay. Now, again, part of the challenge I have, and it filters back to what I said earlier about solicitors, is they don't like taking advice. So what I would typically say to one of my clients is, your firm is worth X. The problem I then have is that seller is just as likely to answer 10X as a quarter X or a half X or 5X. In fact, I've got one firm I'm selling at the moment where I know the client is asking 10 times more than I've told him what it's worth, and he can't understand why nobody will buy it. And so I have probably sent him 45 leads over the last few months, and he can't understand why nobody will buy it, but they all ring me up and say, this guy's nuts. Nobody's going to buy that practice for whatever he's asking for. I mean, typically, I mean, I've got the latest firm I'm selling at the moment, which is in the city. It's been on the market about 6 weeks. I've had about 40 inquiries for it. So I do get a lot of inquiries, but my role is very much putting the parties together and letting the seller, who's my client, work with the potential buyer. And then what happens then is that during the evenings, when all the meetings have taken place, I then get every night a succession of phone calls from the sellers saying, I just met with Mr. Bloggins, and this is what he's offered me, and this is how the deal. What do you think? And so obviously I'm conflicted out of advising the buyer in those circumstances. I can only advise the seller. So I advise my clients as to whether they're good deals and how to move forward. But having said that, about increasingly 15-20% of my work now, I'm actually acting for the buyers rather than for sellers. So I do get a number of firms who say to me, we are looking to buy a practice in Town X. It's really just how I started. You know, we're looking to buy a firm here, or in London, or in North Wales, or in the Northwest. Go out and find a firm for us to buy. So in that case, I'm acting for the buyer, not the seller.
Okay, okay. And so, sort of finally, what do you think the legal marketplace will look like in, say, 5 years? I mean, you're saying it's quite buoyant now. Do you think there'll be more international players coming in, or where do you see it going?
It's very hard to predict. I mean, I look back over the years I've worked with solicitors, and it seems to have lurched from one crisis to another. And at the moment, the current crisis is, you know, the reforms in the personal injury market, and everybody's crying about that. If I go back 5 years, everybody was talking about hips, and that's going to be the best thing that's ever going to happen. It's going to be the worst thing that's ever going to happen, or it will never happen. And all of those things did happen in the space of about a year, and the sun still came up in the east. It's still set in the west, and I think that's how the legal profession will be. I think it's going to go through a continual turmoil and change. There's no denying now that the marketplace is much tougher for law firms. They're not making as much money as they used to. Budgets are tight. I personally see the biggest casualty at the moment is going to be the high street, or as I call the GP law firms, the firms that are doing a multiplicity of legal work are finding it harder and harder to cope. So what I'm seeing is the firms in the high street will gradually disappear, and there might just be one general practitioner type firm in each town. But at the bottom end, what I'm seeing are more and more specialist firms that only do employment, they only do debt collection, they only do matrimonial. So the market is going through a change. But what amazes me is actually still how many people want to get into the profession, how many people want to qualify as lawyers, how many of those lawyers still want to run their own businesses. But the younger folks, 28, 30-year-old solicitors that are coming through now, have a different work ethic. They're far more switched on in terms of databases, search engine optimization, Google and AdWords, and the use of websites than some of the more mature clients I have. So it's going through a change. I think in 5 years there will be equally as many firms as there are now, but it will be in a different shape. And I think there'll be far more specialist firms and far fewer general practitioners. But the market, I still think, will continue. I mean, the legal market is one of the oldest professions, and it will continue, just in a slightly different format.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, that's been really interesting, Ray.
Thank you. Why do you
Anything else to add before we close?
Well, the only thing I would like to mention is obviously the websites again, because that's where the information is. Solicitorsupermarket.biz, bottomlineconsultancy.com, ray.fox@virgin.net generally finds me. You know, I've worked for so many law firms. There are very few things now that crop up that I'm not able to handle when it comes to the buying, selling, merging, valuing market. So I'm available. I'd like to think I have a good reputation. There are remarkably few, if any, other companies or individuals doing what I do. I wouldn't be as arrogant as to say that I have a monopoly in what I do, but I'm pretty sure I'm the market leader, but I don't really come across anybody else that is in this market. So if anyone needs help, if you're a solicitor and you don't know who to turn to, just give me a call. I have a lot of contacts. I generally know how to get from A to B, and the hardest thing with most solicitors is that they actually don't know where A and B are. And that's the problem. But it's been a pleasure talking to you, Lisa. Let me know if I can help you in the future.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So that's Ray Fox, mergers and acquisitions broker for law firms. It's the Bottom Line Consultancy, and the website is Solicitorsupermarket.biz. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Ray.
Thank you and goodbye.